That's great. All right. I think we're ready to go here. Just one more minute and we'll get started. Welcome, Taryn and Christopher and Andrew. It's great to have you all join us. All right, we are at the top of the hour. We do have a large group today, so while we're waiting for people to join, please again introduce yourselves in the chat if you haven't already. Let us know what part of the state you're joining from, maybe what organization you're with, and what you do. English closed captioning is available today. Instructions will be placed in the chat by Arthi. Thank you, Arthi. We did confirm requests for Spanish interpretation. If this support is needed in the future, please be sure to request at least a week in advance. This service will always be made available upon request at least a week in advance. This service, let's see here, I think I already read that part. If you have any technical questions, please direct message me. My name is Sabrina Lord-Lindy, and I'm a program director for N5 Solutions, joining from San Francisco today. While we're waiting for people to join, please introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know what part of the state you're joining from. All right. Next slide, please. Thank you. N5 would like to humbly acknowledge that we are visitors on the unceded ancestral lands of the first peoples of what is known today as the state of New Mexico, including its pueblos, tribes, and nations, past and present. With respect, we honor and recognize all Indigenous peoples, their histories, and their ties to the land. Thank you. Next slide. We have a few housekeeping items to go over before we dive in today, including handouts were emailed yesterday. Be sure to download the handouts for today's breakout exercise. Arthi's going to place those into the chat for you here shortly. If you have any questions during this session, please raise your Zoom hand or place your question into the chat. If you have any technical issues, direct message me. My name's Sabrina Lord-Lindy, but I will update my name really quick to say IT support at the front of it so that you can easily locate me if you need it. Okay. We recommend that you change your view to standard view, and there are some screenshots of how to go about doing this. But if you aren't familiar with it, oh wait, there isn't one. Okay, in the top right corner of your screen, you should see a little box that says view. If you click on it and click on the top option that says standard, that should get you oriented for a better experience today. At the end of this session, we'll provide a link to a workshop survey, and we encourage all participants to give feedback as this really helps us to improve the workshop. If you are requesting CEUs or participation credits, please be sure to update your screen name to be your first and last name. To be in compliance with the New Mexico Counseling Board and NASW of New Mexico, we need to prove that you were in attendance. If you claim a certificate of credit and our reports indicate that you weren't here, then we just have to withdraw those CEUs. To earn the full 2.0 credits, you must attend the entire session, participate in the breakouts, and complete the survey at the very end of this session. And unfortunately, we cannot email the link for that survey after the session's concluded. If there's any questions about that, feel free to direct message me. All right, we will have breakout activities today and opportunities for discussion. So if you're with multiple colleagues on one device, I invite you to please put a hashtag sign at the start of your name. We will be sure to not assign you to a breakout room with other people, so that way you can do that with your colleagues on your own, right, in that breakout activity. Please see the instructions that are going to be placed into the chat here shortly on how to do this. And while we highly encourage you to participate in the breakouts, we understand that sometimes it's not feasible. If this applies to you, we ask that you put an asterisk or that star symbol at the start of your name. Keep in mind that you will need to deduct half a CEU from the total CEUs you claim today if you can't participate in the breakouts. There are no scheduled breaks, so please be sure to take care of yourself over the next 2 hours. Have a pen and paper or other note-taking device handy to write your reflections. Keep your camera on if you can throughout the training. The exceptions to this would include having issues with your internet, or you have to step away for a minute, okay? And again, please feel welcome to raise your Zoom hand or use the chat if you have any questions. Our chat monitor will keep an eye out for them and notify our speaker of the questions at an appropriate time, okay? So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Kurt Lebeck. Kurt is the Chief Science Officer of Howl Collaborative and RCADE Tools, and serves as President and Executive Director of the New Mexico chapter of the American Society of Addiction Medicine. Kurt is a behavioral health services scientist, clinical social worker, and adjunct professor of social welfare policy at Smith College School for Social Work. With lived experience in recovery, he specializes in training and supporting therapists, counselors, and certified peer and community support workers. Kurt has led statewide implementation and policy initiatives to expand peer-delivered services, recovery housing, and medications for opioid use disorder. He is nationally recognized for developing practical strengths-based tools that help frontline staff and clinicians engage clients, document meaningful work, and improve retention and recovery outcomes across New Mexico and the United States. With that, I'd love to hand it over to you, Kurt. You ready to go?
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. We are going to be talking today about this idea of beyond diagnosis, practical tools for engaging neurodivergent clients in behavioral health. We're going to work on recognizing key symptoms and functional challenges associated with ADHD, ASD, and a few other common forms of neurodivergence in adults and young adults. We're going to learn to apply some practical communication and support strategies responsive to neurodivergent needs, and of course, develop a collaborative service plan or interventional plan appropriate for a CCSS credential or a community health worker. We have a poll, and I'm hoping to get a sense of who's in the room. So if you would take a few moments to fill this out, and we will in the poll when we have about 80% of folks.
And may I invite you all, since there are, we have folks that have requested to get Spanish interpretation today, there's a way to expand this window so it makes it a bit wider and you can see the entirety of that translated version of the option of question. The option that you can be selecting for this question rather. Your mouse, if you just click on that little bottom right corner along the side of the window with your mouse, a little arrow will appear and you can just click and drag. It's pretty intuitive.
So it's looking like we've got about 75% or so, almost 80, and it looks like the majority of folks are community behavioral health with some outpatient mental health coming up in a strong second with a handful of other folks. So thank you very much for doing that. I think I need to stop sharing this. Let's see. There we go. All right. Going to move on. Thank you for taking time to do that.
And there's one more poll, right?
Oh, yeah. Is that? I didn't see it, so.
Can we go ahead and launch that other one, Laura? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Same drill we'll wait till we have about 80% and then share those results. It's great. It looks like we have a lot of CCSS credential holders in the room, a lot of community support workers, quite a few CPSW folks, and a handful of social workers and counselors. So that's fantastic. Case managers as well. And I think everybody's had a chance to see that. I'm going to go ahead and move on. All right. So if you would just take a moment, however that looks for you, whatever's comfortable, just to kind of reflect for a second on why you entered this field, why you do the work that you do. And feel free to put a few words in the chat, and I'll ask, since I can't monitor the chat with this display, I'll ask Sabrina to mention a few of the words that keep coming up.
And can I invite you to actually share what is being asked here for our interpreters so that they can interpret what is being prompted?
Hold on one second. I actually can see that. Okay. So it says, please take a minute to settle, however that looks for you, and take a moment to reflect on why you work in this field. Please put a few words in the chat about why you work in this field. And I have figured out how to multitask, so I can actually see the chat now. Got a lot of responses. This is fantastic.
That's great. And Sarah's also going to be here to support with
Yes.
calling out comments and feedback and questions.
A lot of
Great.
the comments so far have been enjoyment of working with families, supporting families, saving lives, getting to know and learn and support others. Working with children and educating them to create a better future. Helping in people, empowering others to make informed decisions. Meeting new people expands knowledge and awareness of their city. Being a change maker and making a difference.
I love all these replies. Love how interactive you all are. This is really wonderful. I ask folks to do this because it always helps to sort of think about why we're doing this kind of work, why we're in this training together, just to ground us in that intention and sort of think about that as we go forward. And I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. Thank you all for participating. So the question is, why beyond the diagnosis? Neurodivergence means meaningful differences in how people think, communicate, regulate emotion, process information, relate socially, and respond to their environment. There is no single normal way to think, communicate, regulate, or relate. As the picture suggests, no one brain is exactly like another. In behavioral health and CCSS settings, neurodivergence is quite common, including among clients who have never been formally diagnosed or who may have been misdiagnosed. And workers may see patterns such as executive functioning barriers, sensory sensitivity, communication differences, social misunderstandings, overload, shutdown, or inconsistent follow-through, even when there's no diagnosis present. CCSS workers are often the people who are going to help translate treatment into life. And when I'm saying CCSS, I mean everybody in the room. But we're thinking about this from the comprehensive community support services sort of angle. So in practice, what that can mean is helping clients understand plans, adapt routines, reduce barriers, regulate stress, and make services more workable in the real world. So this training is less about labeling and having words that fit precisely and more about recognizing patterns that are going to affect engagement, dignity, and ultimately our outcomes. So we're going to do another activity here. And the intention of this activity is to start thinking in terms of strengths. And again, trying to get beyond labels, trying to get beyond this idea that the label, it may be meaningful to a client. I don't want to say that it isn't, but sometimes labels can really get in the way, and we can really start to see them less as people and more as this label. And so take a moment to answer these questions, and I'll go ahead and read the English version. Your personal or professional superpower, the strengths of your area of practice or your credential, the strengths of your program or work setting, and the strength of your personal community or strengths of your personal community. And then finally, your biggest challenge when it comes to providing services. So write those things down so that we can do this breakout activity, which will be a few minutes. And we're going to have these questions in the chat as we go into the breakout room. And so here's the question that I'd like you to think about when you're in the breakout room together. How might you use those strengths or your superpower to tackle your biggest challenge? And feel free to just have a conversation with each other, talk about what strengths you have and how you might use them, to handle the biggest challenge. So, for example, a big challenge that I've run into is communication in organizations that I've worked with, wherein certain credentials don't have opportunities to talk to other credentialed providers, right? So thinking about like sometimes how medical staff don't have the opportunity to talk to the social work staff, and the social work staff don't have time to or opportunity to talk to the community support staff. And so one of my strengths is I like to think of myself as a good communicator and facilitator. And so I like to use that personal strength to help facilitate conversations among those teams and try to foster a room full of or a practice full of interdisciplinary providers who are all operating in a similar level. So that would be like an example. So I'm going to go to the next slide and take over for the breakout room. All right. Thank you. I hope everybody had a chance to work
Bueno,
together.
espero que todos tengan
Would a
la
couple of
oportunidad de trabajar
folks want to
juntos.
share out what
Tenemos
what
un
they
par
came up
de
with in terms of how they might use
personas
strengths
que nos
to
puedan compartir
tackle
cómo
a
les fue en
challenge in
términos
their
de
organization
cómo pueden
or in
utilizar las fortalezas para
whatever their biggest
manejar
Can I
los
challenge is?
pause you,
desafíos en la
Kurt?
organización.
I need to pause you for just a moment. I'm sorry. I'm
Necesito
hearing
una
one of our
pausa.
interpreters, and if you could please just make sure you're on the correct channel while you interpret. Thank you so much. Let's just make sure that audio is checked out now. Can I hear from you, Kurt?
Yeah. So I'll say it again.
Thank you.
Hoping to hear back from a group or two about how they might use their strengths to address a challenge. Anybody like to volunteer? Raise your Zoom hand. And
our group was group 3, I believe, and how to use listening to get people to open up. And a strength for several of us was the ability to listen and also use that to allow the other people to open up.
wonderful. Yeah, that's a great example. It's incredible the power of actually careful and attendant listening, isn't it? what people are willing to say and help us understand. James? I lost James.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. My apologies.
Yeah.
It's Jamie, actually. James is my legal name, but just so you guys have it correct on the CEU. But no, a couple things we talked about: lived experience, being able to kind of empathize and meet clients where they are, helping using reliability and and follow through and accountability to help clients be successful. And then, being able to take complex, big picture topics and being able to distill them down and break them down into more manageable chunks. All those things in my group, was group 19, I believe, breakout group, is mainly what we had talked about. And just really a lot of what we see is just stigma and a lot of barriers related to that.
That's fantastic. You guys covered a lot of ground. That's very, very nice. How about Stephanie, and then we'll have to move on.
Hi. So I accidentally got out a little too early for myself. I cut myself off, but everybody else had a lot to share, which is really great. Also talked about being with empathy throughout their whole thing, working with kids and families, talking about communications. So that's like a big part of like what we all experience is the big difference in communication and how it affects their support. Like I said, I wasn't able to talk on my part, but I did want to bring up boundaries. Like being within this field has taught me a lot about boundaries, and that's pretty much what everybody kind of had to say.
Perfect. Thank you. That's fantastic. So it sounds like people were able to do this activity and get something out of it. I think key point of this is to really just learn, as you all apparently are already doing, but as we're practicing with individuals, finding our own strengths, finding their strengths, and then figuring out ways to work together so that we're syncing along those lines. So it sounds like folks are already on the path to being able to do that really quite well. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. So we're going to talk about stigma and bias a little bit, and we're running a little bit behind, so I'm gonna kind of talk quickly. And one of the big barriers that occurs in this kind of work is that our own stigma and our own bias can show up, right, in the work we do with others. And so one of my hope here is that we can start talking about that and start being a little reflective about our own bias. So you might be asking yourself, what does stigma and bias have to do with learning about neurodivergence? And it has a lot to do with how misreading behavior because of our own biases or what we think is quote unquote normal can actually shape what we do as care providers, right? So those assumptions can introduce stigma and we might not even be aware of it. And so part of the goal of this is to sort of help us reflect on how bias and stigma shows up in our lives and in our minds. We're not going to be calling anybody out on anything. Don't worry about anything like that. But we just want you to reflect on it because one of the things that research shows is that those of us who are able to sort of recognize our own biases are much more likely to develop a trusting, helpful relationship with our clients and also in other spaces in our lives. So take a moment, just quietly reflect on what your first explanation for this behavior is. I'm going to show you a couple of cases, and I'm going to provide a little bit more information. But basically, it's the same behavior. A person misses 2 appointments, they didn't return your call, and then they're irritable when they are reached. Sort of just take a moment and just notice, who do you think of when you see that case presentation? What comes into your mind? And then ask yourself, what else might be true about that? What other scenarios could be possible? And ask yourself what words might end up in their chart, or if you're taking notes in some other way, what kind of words might end up in the communications you have with other providers? And what kind of response, finally, might be helpful before we confront this person or try to correct the behavior. And now I'm going to show you another case, this time with a little bit more detail about the individual. And again, just notice what do you feel? What do you notice right away? So now we're talking about a 19-year-old white male who has a diagnosis of ADHD and who lives with his mother. Does that evoke, or do you imagine something else when you see those words or hear that description for this client? Same behavior. And is that behavior, or is that what you feel and kind of what your spidey sense tells you, is that different from when you didn't have a case profile or a characteristics to now? Did you have the exact same thoughts? And then we're going to do case B. And this is a 44-year-old Native woman who is doing the caretaking of her grandchildren, and she's working part-time. Again, same behavior. And the question is basically, what do you notice? Do you think of different feelings, the different ideas come to mind, or is it the same? And again, you don't need to put anything in the chat, or just reflect on this. So again, we're going to start talking a little bit about some words that get used in some of these contexts and how these words shape how we as providers think of our clients. So read each word to yourself and just notice the first person that comes to mind and ask yourself why. Ask yourself if it's fair to that person. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The point is, again, not to call you out, but just to notice on what comes to mind. And then what happens when you're working with a different person and these words or words like them are used? Is that fair? Again, maybe it is, maybe it is not. But if we catch ourselves when we are being unfair or using stigmatizing language, we can and will have better relationships with those with whom we work. And again, studies demonstrate that virtually everyone is subject to bias, but not everyone tries to recognize it. And so those who do are going to be much more effective at the work that they do and have deeper connections to their clients. Bias comes from the environment. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. Growing up, we see certain kinds of folks on TV or on social media, and we're told by those around us about which kinds of people we can trust and which we cannot. And much of this happens before we're even old enough to even know what's being said. So another activity, just to think about how it feels when people have, put us in these positions ourselves. So think of the last time someone assumed your intentions or treated you differently than someone else doing the exact same thing. Put 1 or 2 words in the chat about how that feels.
Frustration, annoyance, irritating, dismissed, misunderstood, overwhelming, humiliation, anger, tension, sadness, defeated. Ooh,
Yeah.
these are coming in quick.
Yeah. It looks like everybody knows what it feels like. And it doesn't feel good. Nobody wants this feeling. And part of the reason that we're doing this exercise is that when it comes to neurodivergence, we can have a lot of ideas, again, about what is normal and what isn't. And those ideas can affect how we receive somebody, just as these feelings you're explaining are how you have felt that in the past. So I'm going to move on and again, shift back to the strengths-based approach. So this section is about strengths-based approaches. The idea is really quite simple. We don't look at what's wrong. We also are looking for what's strong. That means noticing capacity, resources, relationships, values, protective factors. And those strengths can help supporting healing, engagement, and change. This fits a trauma-informed practice quite well. Trauma-informed practice asks us to see behavior in context. It asks us to understand that people often adapt in order to survive, and it also asks us to support safety, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. A strengths-based approach helps us do all of that. So it moves us away again from this deficit-focused or pathologizing responses into a what is strong, what is going well perspective. Wellness and recovery capital refer to the internal and external resources that help people begin and sustain recovery, mainly through maintain healthy routines and move toward the life that they actually want. A strengths-based approach asks what supports, what relationships, skills, and sources of meaning are already present in a person's life, and how can we use those strengths that they already have to strengthen maybe some opportunities or challenges that somebody else might have. Many people find it helpful to think about wellness and recovery capital in three broad domains: individual, social, and community. Individual capital includes personal strengths and practical resources. Examples include hope, determination, problem-solving skills, persistence, self-awareness, money, and external factors or external resources might include money, a phone, a car, and a stable routine. Social capital includes meaningful relationships. This can include family, chosen family, close friends, mentors, sponsors, co-workers, faith communities, and others who provide trust, encouragement, and accountability or practical help. Community capital includes access to resources and places that make life more workable. Examples might include transportation, community centers, treatment providers, recovery housing, support groups, schools, libraries, employers, and safe public spaces. All three of these are potential sources of strength. As we move from the last slide to this one, I want to point out that culture is not separated from wellness and recovery capital. It's woven through all of it. You might say it's braided through all of it. Culture can shape individual capital by influencing identity, values, purpose, and the way a person makes sense of struggle and healing. It can shape social capital through family roles, kinship ties, elders, neighbors, faith communities, and other trusted relationships. And it can shape community capital through language, shared practices, places of belonging, and access to culturally meaningful supports. Language is part of this too. Language can be a resource. It can be a source of safety, trust, clarity, dignity, and connection. For some people, healing and support make the most sense in the language that they use at home, with family, or in a community. Values and traditions can also be a powerful source of strength. That might include ceremony, prayer, shared meals, mutual aid, storytelling, music, or ways of caring for one another that are rooted in their culture. So part of strengths-based practice is asking about things like preferred language, important relationships, and cultural sources of support. We don't treat culture or language as a barrier. We recognize them as a part of a person's wellness capital. This next idea also fits closely with trauma-informed practice. Resilience is another form of wellness capital. It's especially important for people living with trauma, chronic stress, or instability. Trauma-informed practice asks us to understand behavior in context. It asks us to ask not only what is wrong, but also what happened, what helped this person survive, and what strengths are still here. Resilience includes adaptation, endurance, and survival, and it includes the ways people have learned to get through difficult conditions. For this last slide in this section, I want to make this quite practical. I'd like you to think of a biased word or phrase that you've heard. Maybe it's been used on a client, maybe it's been used for you, or some other context. It might be something like difficult, non-compliant, manipulative, lazy, resistant, or not motivated. And now I want you to reframe it. What is a more respectful, more accurate, more strengths-based way to describe what may be happening? For example, instead of saying resistant, we might say cautious, protective, not feeling safe yet. So in the chat, please share one alternative. You don't need to share the original biased word if you don't want, but if you want, you can put the biased word and the alternative together. Let's see how we do. All right.
All right.
Go ahead.
Pretty good. Guarded is one, controlling versus protective, alternative and healing, resistant to self-protective, emotional, stubborn, can be independent or having a strong sense of identity, manipulative, hostile, reserved rather than non-compliant, sensitive, assertive and strong-willed, emotional versus expressive, reserved and cautious, unmotivated, interesting, obnoxious in comparison to expressive, overstimulated, culturally sensitive, challenging versus cautious, supportive instead of controlling.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think those are all really good. And I love that last one that I'm seeing right now. Person with a substance use disorder instead of addict, right? So yeah, that's wonderful. Again, you guys seem to be able to get all of this quite well, so I love it. We're moving in a good direction. So we're going to talk a little bit about cultural and structural context. And this starts with a simple point. Behavior does not happen in a vacuum. Even neurodivergent behavior does not happen in a vacuum. Behavior is shaped by context. What people do, how they respond, and how they function are all influenced by the conditions they're living in. Culture matters here too. Systems matter. They shape what gets seen as normal, appropriate, cooperative, or concerning. Poverty, trauma, and exclusion also shape functioning in very real ways. They affect stress, attention, planning, regulation, and follow-through. And research on stress and scarcity actually helps explain why. When people are under chronic stress or living with too little time, money, safety, or stability, it reduces bandwidth that can affect attention, decision-making, organization, and emotional regulation. So structural inequity does not just shape access, it also shapes the behavior itself. So the point of this section is that the context will help explain what might otherwise be misread. Institutional norms are the often unspoken rules that shape what a system treats as normal, appropriate, or cooperative. They influence how helpers interpret behavior, and these norms often reflect dominant cultural expectations rather than the full range of how people communicate, regulate, or engage. They're not universal. Many of us start learning institutional norms very early, often in elementary school or even before. We may learn what counts as paying attention, being respectful, following directions, speaking at the right time, and moving through systems in the right way. People who come into a setting without that same early training, or whose families, cultures, languages, or life experiences taught different norms, may not know what those expectations are. Not every difference is going to be a symptom. Culture also shapes things like eye contact, tone, pace, emotional expression, and family roles. That matters because neurodivergence and culture can sometimes look similar on the surface. If we're not careful, there's a real risk of treating cultural behavior as a pathology. This again goes back to why we are reflecting on our biases and assumptions. Because if our assumption is that the behavior in front of us is somehow bad or, inappropriate, but we haven't taken into consideration the context in which the person is coming, we may be making a mistake, and it may break down the ability for that person to trust us with the work that we need to do together. Structural context shapes first impressions. Clients are often judged by surface cues. Again, poverty, language, trauma, and racism all affect how people are read. Worn clothing may reflect poverty, not necessarily incapacity. Guarded or irritable behavior may reflect trauma or instability in their life. What looks difficult may actually be an adaptation or a self-protective characteristic or style. The key point is to slow down judgment and ask why or in what context might be shaping that behavior. Chronic stress and financial strain can narrow mental bandwidth. They can make everyday tasks much harder to manage. And when people live with ongoing scarcity, the brain often shifts towards immediate survival. That can reduce capacity for planning, memory, regulation, decision-making, and follow-through. So what looks like a disorganized, inconsistent, or unmotivated client may actually reflect bandwidth limits and not a lack of caring or intention. You all, everybody who identified themselves particularly as community support and CCSS workers have real power, even when we think of ourselves mainly as helpers. That power can be used in helpful ways, but it can also become controlling, even when we do not mean it to. In practice, workers can slip into a few roles. One is the compliance enforcer. That's when we focus more on the rules and barriers. Another is when we focus more on the rules than on the barriers. Another is the appointment police. That's when we focus on attendance instead of asking what is making follow through or showing up difficult. A third is the rescuer. And that's when we do too much for the client instead of building skills, partnerships, and shared problem solving. The main risk in all three roles is the same. We may mistake somebody's overwhelm for refusal. Language shapes how clients understand, respond, and take part in care. When services happen in a different language, pace, or communication style than what fits the client best, behavior can be misread. A person may seem vague, slow, resistant, unmotivated, when what's really happening is a mismatch and an overload. Research on language access, cognitive load, and communication barriers help explain this. Translation, slower processing, code switching, and form-heavy systems all increase mental effort. So clients are often judged for signs of overload when they are already doing extra work just to get through the interaction. Clients may think in one language and receive services in another. When language, pace, or phrasing do not match the client, behavior can be misread. A person may seem vague, slow, avoidant, or unmotivated when the real issue is processing and translation. For example, a client may understand the visit well in Spanish, but then struggle to respond in English. That person may look vague or disengaged, but what may really be happening is extra mental work just to be understood, just to translate, and just to respond. Code switching means changing how a person speaks, acts, or presents in different settings. People often do this to fit in and to stay safe, or to feel safe, and to avoid being misread. It takes a lot of mental work to do that kind of switching. And from a form-heavy system can add even more mental load. For example, a person may have only one style at home, another in the clinic, and another with a clinician, and that might look inconsistent. But it's actually a reflection of their ability to adapt, self-protect, and avoid becoming overloaded.
I'm going to pause you. There was a question in the chat from
Sure.
Sophia. Can you repeat the list of the CCSS approaches again?
Repeat the list of the CCSS approaches. I'm going back here. I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Sophia, can you come off mute and share what you're looking for clarification on?
Sure. So you had said that there was like one who was focused on the rules or the structure more,
Right.
another who was like, yeah, that's really good to know to kind of identify those types of behaviors. I know they're not intentional all the time, and so it just helped to strengthen the provider.
Yeah. So that list was the compliance enforcer, the appointment police, and the third is the rescuer. Does that
Thank you
answer?
so much.
Sure.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. All right. now we're going to talk more specifically about neurodivergence in practice. As we move into this next section, I want to ground us in one practical point. Neurodivergent and related presentations are common, super common in adult behavioral health and CCSS settings. That includes many clients who are undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or have never been formally assessed. So in practice, workers will see these patterns whether or not there's a diagnosis in the chart. Research also shows that these patterns are common in the general population and often even more common in clinical settings. And just because somebody doesn't have a diagnosis, even if they have been assessed, doesn't mean that they won't have some of these characteristics as just part of the natural diversity, again, of all of us, right? There is, again, no single idea of normal, or there's no single brain that we can all use or look to say that is the model that everybody's brain should look like. It's just not how human diversity works. We are all very different. And so this section is about helping you notice some common presentations, thinking about what they might mean in context, and responding in ways that are practical, respectful, and supportive. We talk first
Pause
about
you again one more
Sure.
time. I'm sorry. So somebody was using a tool on Zoom to draw. I'm not quite sure what happened there. There's a way to erase it from your desktop. I'm not sure if you know how to do this, but there's a cursor on the bottom left corner of your screen that lights up green when you click on it. And there should be like an erasing button, or you can do clear, that there's a trash button, and click clear and it should clear it out. There you go. I think
All
there's
right.
another streak up in the upper right a little bit. There you go.
There we go.
Since we are recording this, I'd love to be able to present something nicely to folks after the fact. So thank you.
No problem. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about prevalence. These patterns are common. They're common enough in the general population, and they're even more common in behavioral health settings. This includes ADHD, autism, learning differences, and sensory processing challenges. There are a handful of others, but they tend to be less common or less often. You're going to run into them less often, and so we're going to leave those out for now, and just really talk about these that are you will run into. So in day-to-day, in your work day-to-day, you're likely to see these patterns quite regularly. And as you may see them, whether or not they're named in the chart, that matters because if we wait for a diagnosis before we respond appropriately, we might miss what the person needs who's sitting right in front of us. So the goal, again, is not so much about diagnosis or to label somebody, but really to just be responsive to what these patterns are and how they present and how we can work with those strengths. For this activity, I want us to shift away from deficits again for a moment and think about people you've worked with who maybe have had a diagnosis of ADHD, autism, or have presented with learning differences or sensory processing challenges. And I'm going to get into detail about what those are in a minute, but if you've already done work with this population, these folks, tell us what strengths you've seen among them in the chat. Tell us what some of some of their superpowers are. Just put one or two words in if you've worked with these folks in the chat. For example, you might write things like creative, persistent, observant, detail focused, determined, any of those kinds of things.
Resilient is one.
Nice.
Flexible. Seen a lot of creative, motivated, thinking outside of the box.
Mm.
Patient, willingness to learn. Brave, friendly, compassionate, empathetic, determined, hopeful, enthusiastic, imaginative, open, self-aware and accepting, adaptable, and creative.
Yeah, those are fantastic. Very nice. Yeah, I can see a lot of you have had these experiences, and so that's really wonderful that you're able to identify those strengths. Before we get into each of these in more detail, I want to pause on this idea of prevalence again. And the main point I'm trying to make here is that these patterns are quite common. You're going to see them again all the time in the various settings in which we work. And what we can see here is about 3 to 5% of the population, this is the general population, have ADHD or are diagnosable with ADHD. This is not to say that if you had sort of some ADHD qualities, you wouldn't necessarily fit into this number, right? But you might have that, and then this number gets even bigger, right? So you might share some characteristics with some an ADHD diagnosis, and you might actually, that if we start thinking about all of those symptoms or behaviors or whatever, we might see these numbers even get bigger. In clinical settings, I work mostly in substance use, and I see this all the time, ADHD in our clinical population. 20% seems low to me. In autism, we see it formally diagnosable in about 2.2% of the population. But again, we'll see autism is on a spectrum from, very mild to severe. And these presentations can be very subtle. And so you can have autistic characteristics or traits and still not meet criteria, so that would make, again, this number expand, become larger. Learning differences are going to be really quite common. There's no universally agreed on number, but they are likely very under-identified. Sensory processing challenges are also quite common, especially in neurodivergent folks and behavioral health populations. And so we're going to get into what each of these means. ADHD in adults often looks less like visible hyperactivity and more like difficulty with organization, time, follow-through, and attention regulation. So in practice, you may see executive functioning challenges, like trouble starting or finishing tasks. You may see forgotten steps, missed appointments, or lost items. You may see a thing called time blindness, wherein somebody is unaware of what time it is completely. You'll see lateness. You'll see people who are quite overwhelmed with paperwork, potentially some restlessness, impulsivity, and potentially some emotional reactivity. Follow-through could look quite inconsistent. And the risk here, of course, is that these patterns get misread, which again is why we started with strengths and thinking about our own biases and assumptions about what is normal. A person might be seen as lazy, careless, and unmotivated or not caring, but many adults, particularly with ADHD, have managed these messages that they're told, you don't care, you don't work hard enough, you don't try hard enough, if you would just sit down and do it. Those kinds of messages, people with ADHD have heard them their whole lives, right? And so a lot of that repeated correction and repeated failure or whatever you want to call it can create a real sense of shame. And so what looks like a disorganized person may actually reflect real effort that has been, unsupported. And this is where you all can make a real difference. When you can recognize some of these patterns and recognize some of the ways that you can support these individuals, you can actually help them much more so than somebody who doesn't do that work.
Kurt, there's a question. It looks like
Sure.
Ify or Iffy.
It's Ife or
Ife.
Ifa. The question I have is the slide, not this one, before the last one, with regard to the percentage of people. Yes, and I agree with you totally about the ADHD because I work in addiction settings as well. But people with autism and learning differences. Is there any statistics on their sensory processing challenges? Because I see the neurodivergence in so many of my clients who are on the spectrum of autism at different levels, and the learning differences, and they all have sensory processing challenges. Depending on when they were diagnosed, some of it's called aphasia. Some of it's, they have all these names. But are there any statistics about the overlap or, the percentage?
I was trying to find a number for that because I'm a sort of numbers person. I love numbers like that, but I couldn't find anything that I could show you that was valid and supported by references and research. What is clear, at least anecdotally from my reading of that research, is that most folks with autism are going to have sensory processing, maybe not challenges, but maybe issues. They might not rise to the level of challenge. We're going to talk a little bit more about autism in a moment. And so as we do, we can sort of think more about what that presentation looks like. But I think you're right. I think we see it a lot in that population. So I hope that addresses.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to give you a quick case example of ADHD. Jordan's 34 and he wants housing, work, and recovery support. He misses appointments even though they say they want help. They arrive late, they lose paperwork, they forget next steps, and they start forms without finishing them. They also become frustrated and ashamed when they're corrected. At that point, the staff may begin to see Jordan as inconsistent or unmotivated. But what may be really happening is something quite different. This may reflect, again, executive functioning challenges, time blindness, working memory overload, and stress. Not to mention shame from repeated failure or criticism, which can make organization even harder. So I want you to think back when we were thinking about those words, when people applied those words to us and we felt, they were unfair, to put it mildly. If you think about living your whole life, your whole adult life, or from an early age even, with those kinds of words about you being said constantly, like you might feel shame before you even have the opportunity to open your mouth, right? Like you might already be in a position where you're basically defended and guarded. And then that behavior gets read as something else, not what it actually is. So this response is going to be a little bit more practical. Again, we're going to look for strengths. We're going to assume effort before assuming resistance or noncompliance. And we're going to work to reduce the task load and break things into smaller parts. We can do forms together in real time instead of handing someone a pile of paperwork. We can use reminders, visual cues, and written next steps. And I mean, quite literally, like when I'm working with folks like this, who I always offer to do this, like I don't assume to do this, but I ask would it be helpful if I complete these with you? And we sit down and we just fill them out together. And just in that, spending that extra 5 minutes together, and I know sometimes in a busy clinic that can be really hard to do, but I strongly encourage you to find that time and find that space and ask for permission, of course, before you do. But often that's what folks need. I remember working in a clinic at one point, and I had a young man who had ADHD, and we, all the counseling rooms were taken, and we were supposed to go work in the common room, and there are literally dozens and dozens of people in this common room, and I could just see the blood rush out of his face when he thought about what that would be like. And so we went and we found the fire escape, and we just, we hung out on the fire escape for 5 or 10 minutes, filled out some paperwork together. And we got to the finishing line together. And I know that may seem unconventional, but sometimes it's absolutely necessary that you make space so that folks can do that work with you. So now we're going to talk a little bit about autism, which again can look very different from one person to another. In adults, it often shows up in how people communicate, read social situations, process sensory input, and handle change. In your settings, those differences also can be misread. A person may seem disengaged, rigid, or uninterested when that's not what's actually happening. You may see limited eye contact, brief answers, literal interpretation of language, distress with sudden change, sensory overload or shutdown, and some autistic adults also mask. Excuse me. Masking means they work really hard to look fine or fit in socially. Masking can hide distress, it can hide exhaustion or confusion. And so what might look like a flat affect or brief, short on words, or maybe they behave like they're distant, that might actually be reflecting a serious effort, not a lack of caring. So again, we try to think about this in a little different when we're approaching it. Here's another quick case to give you a little idea what this looks like in practice. And of course, all these cases are syntheses of people that I've worked with over time. And the images are stock images, so no worries about client confidentiality here. Maya is 29 and wants help with benefits, transportation, and staying connected to recovery support. She gives short answers, avoids eye contact, and seems uncomfortable in the office. When the schedule changes without warning, she becomes visibly distressed. She also takes an instruction literally and misses what the staff meant. Then the office gets noisy. She becomes overwhelmed, shuts down, and stops responding. At that point, staff may begin to see Maya as rigid, withdrawn, uninterested. But what may be really happening is different. This may reflect social communication differences, a strong need for predictability, literal language processing, sensory overload, and a shutdown under stress. It may also reflect masking or the effort, again, to cope with being in an unfamiliar setting. So we think about what that looks like. See this kind of presentation quite often with autism, and we have a kind of a different strengths-based approach to address it. Again, we're going to assume difference, not defiance. And from there, we're going to want to reduce sensory load when we can. We want to use clear, concrete, and literal language. It also helps to explain changes in advance whenever possible. We can offer written steps and predictable routines, and we should ask about communication and sensory preferences. We should also allow for extra processing time without pressure. And finally, we should not force eye contact or a rapid response. We can always check in about how well they're understanding something without shaming. And as always, we should name those strengths. This might include self-awareness, persistence, honesty, and the effort it takes to stay engaged. I think a lot about a case that had where somebody with had a really hard time with sudden changes in the plan. And what that literally looked like was this person would become quite stiff, like literally stiff in front of me. And until I started to understand a little bit better, I didn't realize what was going on. And so that presentation, that person was panicking, basically. Like, oh my God, this pattern, this plan that we had outlined has to change. And they have a hard time processing that change. So again, help the person by, relaxing yourself, not what is wrong, but rather like, I can see that this is maybe stressful. Let's think about how we can work together to mitigate this problem. Learning differences affect how people read, write, and work with numbers, as well as process information. They're not signs of low intelligence. In your settings, they may be well hidden. They can be misread as low motivation, confusion, or low functioning, and you may see trouble with reading, writing, or numbers. You may see avoidance of forms or written instructions, and a person may need information read aloud. They may have trouble tracking dates, times, or steps, and they may be much stronger in conversation than on paper. Many people work very hard to hide these difficulties. When they go undiagnosed, they can carry a lot of shame. Some people with dyslexia or dyscalculia have spent years feeling like they're less than other people. So hiding the struggle may look like avoidance, defensiveness, or disengagement. And one simple support is to read the written material out loud. And I will add personally, many people, including myself, understand written information better when a computer reads it out loud, or you can get like Audible to read the book to you, things like that. Here's another quick case. Elena is 42 and wants help with housing and benefits. She avoids forms and says she will finish them later, or takes them home and doesn't bring them back. She misses written instructions and mixes up dates or steps. But she speaks clearly about her goals and what she wants. She also becomes embarrassed when the paperwork comes up. What may be happening here is not a lack of interest. It may be literal difficulty with reading, writing, or numbers. It may be slower processing of written information. And it may involve shame from past school or system experiences. Again, going back to that, when we were talking about what institutional norms are, you think about what the good students are versus the people who have maybe some learning differences. And often the people with learning differences are treated as bad students, right? Even though it's really fundamentally just neurodivergence at a young age. And again, what we see often is that people who are not diagnosed or not given the right supports early in life live with a lot of shame, feeling like they're bad people, being told that they don't work hard enough, they don't try hard enough. And then we see them in our clinics and in our settings where they don't really want to talk about that. And they have a lot of, frankly, trauma around those experiences. So our strengths-based approach here starts with a basic shift in how we interpret their problem. Don't assume that the difficulty with paperwork means low ability. Instead, we can offer to read the forms aloud and complete them together, and we can use plain language and go one step at a time. We can also ask what helps her learn and remember best. That question alone can open up a much more respectful and useful conversation. It's important to protect dignity and privacy, of course, and to respect cultural ways of communicating and asking for help. Finally, we should name strengths. In this case, that might include verbal strengths, persistence, and resourcefulness. Sensory processing challenges can involve noise, light, touch, movement, texture, or crowded spaces. What feels normal or manageable for one person may feel overwhelming or even painful for another. I chose the image of steel grinding for a reason. For someone I know, that sound literally feels painful in their head. It feels like they're having an excruciating migraine when they hear even knives rubbing together. I spent nearly 20 years as a metal fabricator, so I heard that sound almost every day. For me, it was totally manageable. But for some people, sounds like somebody chewing can make it impossible to think. It can feel like the sound is deep inside their head. And this goes for any of the sensory processing challenges. Like the texture can be so intense of a fabric that the person can't tolerate it. They can't wear that particular kind of fabric because it just feels awful to them. And again, there's nothing wrong with their brain. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just that their sensory system is different than ours. One more case. Luis is 28 and wants help with housing. But he leaves when the waiting room gets too loud. He says some spaces overwhelm him very quickly. At that point, staff may begin to see him as avoidant or irritable or inconsistent. But what may be really happening is quite different. He may be sensitive to noise or crowded environments. He may be getting overloaded quite quickly. He may have trouble filtering out competing sounds and other input. So leaving the space may be less about refusal and more about just figuring out how to cope. So our strengths-based approach here starts by not treating sensory overload like it's a behavior problem. We do not want to read this as defiance, avoidance, or an attitude problem. Instead, we can ask what kinds of spaces feel manageable and what tends to be overwhelming. We can reduce noise and sensory overload when possible, and we can offer quieter spaces, different times, or slower pace. We can also explain what to expect and keep the setting as predictable as we can. And what that literally looks like is saying, okay, the next step that we're going to take is X, Y, or Z, right? As opposed to just doing it. So the goal is to make the environment much more workable and predictable, not to force the person by simply to push through it, right? And finally, in this case, we might include the strengths of self-awareness, honesty, and the effort it takes to stay engaged when the space feels overwhelming. So now we are going to get into some practice. In this final section, we're going to shift from concepts to practice. We're going to use case examples to identify barriers, strengths, bias risks, and practical next steps across the individual, clinic, and system levels. We're going to compare and contrast cases. One is going to be ADHD forward, and one is ASD, or autism spectrum disorder forward. Both include culture, language, trauma, and stress, and system context. Over the next about 35 minutes, we're going to break this down into two cases. And your job is to identify the challenges at 3 levels. When you get these cases, the handouts, I think they should be handing them out now if they haven't already. You're going to look for the individual challenge, the clinic level challenge, and the system level challenge. And you're going to identify likely bias, risks, and misreadings. You're going to identify immediate engagement strategies, as well as environmental and communication supports, and then identify strengths and wellness capital. And then think about how you can use those strengths and wellness capital to draw up a next steps, like coaching or action plan. And then when you come back, I want to hear from some groups about what strengths, barriers, and practical strategies you've identified and what client-centered next steps you think would be appropriate. So again, here are the instructions. I think these are on the handout.
So in the chat, you'll see 2 links for the handouts, and we recommend that you access those now while you can and use that to guide you through this activity. Do you want to give them a little bit of prompting on what they're going to be doing during the breakout, Kurt?
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how to look at my handout at the same time. Let me see if I can pull that up. There it is. Okay, so if you have the handout, again, you don't have to share out, but ideally everybody shares out a little bit because I think we all learn best from each other and our various experiences. But if you'd like to share your group's responses, remember to write down your group number so that you can share that out. You're going to have the first breakout. We're going to do the first case, which is ADHD, which is on the second page of the handout. And then we'll return to the main room for a brief report out, about 5 minutes. The second one, we're going to just do case 2, which is the autism spectrum disorder. And again, you'll have about 10 minutes. Ultimately, the case, the group tasks are basically to identify the challenges at the 3 levels. So you're looking for, in the case, what the individual level challenges are, maybe what the clinic level challenges are. So if you're thinking about the clinic in which she's probably going to be, you're going to be thinking about what that might look like. You're welcome to use your own clinics as experience or own treatment settings, or imagine them if you don't work in that kind of program. And then and we really want you to think about the system challenges. And this again kind of goes back to those ideas of what are institutional or cultural norms and how those show up in our systems, right? What does that actually look like? Maybe it is something like getting access to Medicaid and how that is sometimes it can be a quite difficult process. It takes a lot of time to be on the phone, things like that. And, what those challenges are like, again, that's a systems level challenge and it can be really frustrating, right? So it spills down into the individual level. But think about some sort of systems challenge that shows up in whatever this case presents. Then I'd like you to think about a little bit about how bias or misreading might show up in the case. Like look at some of the words that are used and think about how that behavior might be interpreted. And again, immediate engagement strategies, like how would you come towards this person? How would you engage them? Identify environmental, communication, cultural, social wellness capital. I've sprinkled some strengths in throughout these cases. so that you can actually pluck those ideas out, and then identify individual wellness capital. So the reason I'm separating that is I'm trying to get you to recognize that there are strengths that are not inherent to the person, right? They can be from a community where they get a lot of support. They might have a social environment where they have a lot of friends who are caring and supportive of what their goals are. Try to recognize some of those strengths as well. And then just think about what you would like to do as a next step. And there's no right or wrong answers to any of this. This is just a way to think about this, how to work with this population.
Training, and I'll hand it over to Kurt.
Thanks, Sabrina. So, did any of the groups have a chance to think about what strengths our client had and how they might use those strengths to overcome their challenges and come up with sort of next step coaching plan? Anybody want to volunteer? We only have a couple of minutes, so.
This is Marion. I just make sure that, or try to make sure that when you meet with this gentleman, that it's quiet and a space where he feels safe.
Mhm.
So, make plans ahead of time to accommodate what he needs.
Very nice. Thank you. Carice?
Our group was saying that because he really likes the structure, that implementing TSF or 12-step facilitation would be good because it's very structured and goal-oriented with checklists. And then because he is so good technically, to get him involved with both recovery meetings on Zoom and then also a career pathway that is online, that's in a quiet space that will help him feel confident and be able to move forward without being overstimulated.
Fantastic. Thank you. How about Jamie?
Yeah, so I'll try to make it brief. We focused on a lot of coaching actions, but mainly working on coping skills and navigating stressful environments that can't be avoided, using a teach back method to ensure understanding, really thinking about the environment and how we can leverage the client's needs. One of his individual strengths was knowing what he needs and what helps him work best. And so letting him be the subject matter expert on his own experience. Researching ASD, de-escalation skills, and then after like verbal teaching, creating a flow chart that have very specific regimental steps that are easy for him to follow because he tends to work well with very technical system, or what I'm trying to say, technical flows. Yeah.
Yeah, no, perfect. Yeah, laying it out very precisely so that it's very predictable. Yeah, great.
There you go.
And one more, Ife.
Our group had a lot of suggestions. One of them was, first of all, take it out of the clinic. He doesn't have to be in the clinic. And also, one of the suggestions was possibly finding out if he would be interested in a case manager. Was he like this from he was born? Because if he was, then we start looking at the developmental disability waiver and seeing if this is something that he would be interested in, because he doesn't have any real family supports. Maybe even getting his cousin involved. I like to get the family involved if the person has someone they trust, and he doesn't have a lot of family, but he does have a cousin that he trusts. The other thing was to keep him as calm as possible, because he seems to have sensory overload. Mm-hmm. And get his trust by, yes, let's text. Whatever makes you comfortable. Once you get beyond that, my experience with people with on the spectrum of autism is once they start to trust you. I have one who she's 20 something, and she actually walks around with a stuffy. The stuffy does all her talking. She's high functioning, okay? But once you get her trust, she starts talking to you.
Mm.
It kind of happens. Just, one day I was speaking to this Stuffy and she goes, "Oh, she can't speak to you right now, but I will." I was blown away because but this took time. It's a trust thing.
No,
So
I have to interrupt, but that is a wonderful example because what you're doing there is, you're going with the flow. You're not making her stop talking to the Stuffy or anything like that. Let her do it the way she's doing it, and guess what? It works. Works just fine. So we have to cut it short, but thank you all very much for those responses. It sounds like you all were able to dive right into that. I'm going to head out to the closing slide here. And just a couple quick reminders. So when we're working with folks who may be neurodivergent or basically anyone, we're going to want to slow down our first impressions, right? We're going to look for strengths, not just symptoms. We're going to ask what context might be shaping that behavior. And we're going to try to notice wellness capital at the different levels, right? At that individual, social, and cultural levels or community levels. And we're going to use and develop clear, respectful, and practical supports for these folks and build next steps with the person, not just for the person. And on that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kurt. All righty. So we do have a few things to go over here. Can you go back actually to, no, go forward one.
Sorry about that.
Oh, good. This is perfect. Thank you so much. All right, before we wrap up, I want to take a moment to thank our trainer, Kurt Lebeck. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your experience, your expertise, all that wisdom that you have brought forward today. And we also want to extend our gratitude to our colleagues at Voces de Vida for providing cultural broker services and to RGC Access for today's interpretation support, which makes these trainings more accessible. Most importantly, thank you to all of our attendees for being here today and engaging with us. We love that you're here and that you could partake in this training. We hope to have you continue to return. Finally, we want to acknowledge BHSD, the Healthcare Authority, for funding this workshop. As part of their support, they've asked us to share a brief disclosure about the nature of CCSS services. Can you go to the next slide for me, please? CCSS is a personalized individual-based service provided by one CSW or CPSW. It is not